Damn. Oh, there it is.
You were
Ding.
looking X. Bing.
Yeah, yeah. Being boring today.
I have not looked at Twitter in some weeks. I think it's too much of an investment for me. Like, I do know that there are these friend groups being forged on there, which may have a lot more to offer than the current circles that I kind of dwell in, but stuck in my ways a little bit. I don't want to make new friends. It's always hard for you or I because our views require a bit of qualification, and you have to find people that are patient and charitable enough to give you the benefit of the doubt
Huh.
on first impression. Everybody has an ideology now. Like, they have views that they're very settled on, and they're steadfast and set in their ways. And it's like everybody wants to be a an advocate and like a proponent. They don't want to be. Everybody wants to lecture. Nobody wants to really learn.
Well, I guess you could say that. Ironically, they tell themselves different. That the rule is measured by those who are the most learned, or at least claim to be.
Hmm.
So, in ironic fashion, the institution of learnedness is uh, catalyzing that very phenomenon as they debate amongst each other who is the most knowed, who knows the most. Hmm.
Yeah, it's a bit paradoxical, really, when you think about it like that, because people they claim to have absorbed all the different ideas and stood on all the shoulders of the giants and everything, but then they have these views which are like rather rigid, and it's very hard to upseat somebody's like doxastic commitments, and it's very
Well,
hard to.
the visualization kind of gives it away. They're standing on the shoulders of giants. I mean, often I think it's the view is looked as if you're standing, like you're at the top above them looking down. That's like, yeah, but you could also model this from the bottom up and notice that you put yourself on a pedestal,
Yeah.
that you're standing on the shoulder of giants. Yeah, yeah, that's how you see yourself. You magnanimous fuck. Ugh, it
I,
kills me,
I,
man.
I
It kills me having to be in the presence of this all the time. Why I feel very very boring today is because I don't have much to like model. I mean, I've been listening for weeks, kind of attempting to manufacture Inspirato, but the sense I make is, oh, it's very mundane. Like I can't. I do my best to reframe what's occurring to like say man like sometimes like construct some novelty. Probably do something new here. It's like no, this is even the variation on the theme isn't impressive enough to note or inspire like engagement, like direct engagement. I find I'm awfully bored about the way people speak about the world.
yeah, we have like a mass Dunning Kruger thing going on with people. I think this was like one of the things the Catholics got right was that they were really scared about like autodidacticism and like people becoming self-educated, and obviously they restricted this to like biblical exegesis and interpretation, but it's like just in general, man, literacy increase the literacy rate, it almost has a sort of horseshoe effect where it circles back around into like a dysgenic effect. Everybody fractures into their own little ontology. And I mean, 90% of people never utilize any of the informational, educational resources that are just free on your phone, on the internet all day. Most of them just, I'd say a good 98% of people probably only use the internet to watch these really pointless TikTok reels where they're like, none of them have any continuity between them. Every single reel is like a blank slate. It's a new context. It's a new thing. Some of them are funny. Some of them are sad. Some of them are romantic. Some of them, etc. And then, but even amongst the people that do, they get into like politics or whatever, and they're like, I want to know kind of more than the average person. Um I want to use my time to educate myself into like being a kind of like a pseudo expert on these topics, but then they'll settle on an ideology and they take it to be the way it is. Like they'll kind of dogmatize it and put this fence up around it. And they just simply become like a mouthpiece for this thing, right? A lot of people settle into like different modes of Christianity, or people will, with Darwinism or whatever. And it's like so offensive to my pragmatic sensibilities because I feel that they're not sensitive to the context within which they're like theorizing. They're just sort of saying like this view models the world in this like one-to-one correspondent manner, and this is the way it is, and if you don't believe us, then you have this problem and you can't answer this problem, and so you have to concede. And they just kind of philosophize around all day, and they only really want to discuss like the intrinsicity of their ideas. They don't want to discuss like um social ramifications of it, like with Christians, for example, right? I tend to like restrict the scope of my analysis of Christianity to like what types of practical consequences will result there from commitments to like Christian theology. Like, is it dysgenic? Can they solve the problem of like charity? Giving charity to the homeless, for example, and the kind of ramifications that has, which like libertarians, I think, rightfully call out. You know, you're sort of artificially like propping up this market for dysgenics, which they would, you know, claim as like inability to self-sustain, right? You're not letting people really fend and things like this, but Christians, for example, will just kind of respond to that by harkening back to like the intrinsic discussion about their religious commitments, like, oh, it's just the way it is. Like, it's just, the Shroud of Turin, bro. We know, like, Jesus was a real historical figure, and even non-Christians, wrote about him and blah, 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 blah. Like, it's very offensive to my, like, pragmatic. Once you learn to think in a very pragmatic way about ideas, like in this Dewey and instrumentalist sort of way, where it's like the strength of the idea is like how well it manages to achieve its purported aims and its own ends and things like this. And they're none. You're not actually like modeling the world as such. You're not trying to like capture the mirror of nature. Or
We're in very different moods right now. I got to put that out there. Even the way you described this, bro, me right now is it's a very pedestrian sense. It's too crude. I mean, I don't even want to frame. I don't even want to frame how I think things are going right now in this way. It's and I get we're recording right now, and for those who are listening, and this is in light of you. Keep that in mind. Uh, there are considerations to those who are listening, and what you're capable of hearing and comprehending, interacting with, and the way our boy Dismal here, right, like frame things is, I think, at least with that in mind, part just tough because then I come in and I want to get liminal, and that means radically altering your perspective of this conversation, like at heart, and then from anything else that can ever be thought of with these sets of considerations, ideas. That's a tough part. And I know I've spoken rather ambiguously, but I think it's essential. Like for me, I'm more want to discuss more directly what we are doing. Say it in a way that I think the audience will comprehend. Knowing the risks, right, that or the potentials that arise from even making a statement in that way, like a verbal utterance. I may exaggerate what you think I might mean, and to kind of inspire like how I'll frame that, because again, to resolve the ambiguousness, is that earlier I gave collective from our last conversation a reference to kind of frame this in a more like mimetic way. Maybe you could think of it that way.
Is there
It's
any way, sorry to cut you off, could you boost your mic just slightly? So really sorry to cut you off.
is that better?
Much better, yeah.
Okay, sorry, it's drifting away from my face. Yeah, a more mimetic way. Um, where we start to tell a story about how we're making all this shit up, essentially, guys. I'm deeply concerned with that. Which resolves like all these other, because when what collective descriptions are is kind of like a mapping of the topography. These are how people are doing things. This is how they're engaging in conversations, creating dialogues. You know, considering ideas. A very broad description, generic description. And me, I'm going, well, let's get some more resolution. Let's talk about how that's occurring, how this phenomenon is very abundantly being generated at a variety of different scales, and which means topics can be from philosophy, right, to science, to relationships, religion. Take your pick. Which I think is where the real goal, like for me, the goal is the the idea that all of our discussions and our conflicts arise from the way that we do things rather than what we are doing. Right? Any particular act, I think, is trivial than how it's enacted, and that seems like rather obvious, when we think about like the application of any well, in any system, right? So you perform an action, right? Well, it's often the considerations is how that thing is done, what sequence the operation unfolds, if you will. And so, like the reference I gave collective was meant to kind of inspire that. I probably didn't have make time to listen to it yet, but perhaps, right? But even if you didn't, it wouldn't. I could still ad lib, right, to kind of generalize what I really want to get at, which is why I'm so bored, because it's like, oh man, I really want to talk about this. Uh, you could say kind of iron it out, like flesh out the model and give it like to make in the pragmatic sense, in the utilitarian, to create a tool can allow us to be more effectual. And what are we trying to affect? Well, just being effectual itself, like getting making shit happen in the most generic sense, which is kind of how we think about the world because our endeavors to maximize it or to make better of it are generally endless in their potential or where we could they where we think they could go or what we can make of it rather. And that being considered, right, that our goal setting is rather ambiguous to start with, even though it's kind of presumed that we have these very specific things we want to get done. Uh, I feel that that foundation is sometimes overlooked and undervalued. Or I like to embrace it. Like, yeah, I know, I know we really don't know where we're going, even though we keep telling ourselves there is a specific place to go. In contrast, most greatly to the obvious, which is like an endless series of goals. But I said, even now, what words do I select? How do I say this? How long do I take? One after the other, and all those ones that like even that sense of linearity is deceptive because it's aggregated, right? It's like multiple decisions being made simultaneously, directed to like a general sense of like specificity. But even with that, it's like it's compressed, just like an act of containment, right? Of what is an endless compendium in the modal sense, right? And that's like
So
in the
there's a number of ways I could could kind of find my way into a response to this, but I is what you're describing when you talked a moment ago about the kind of shifting of our focus away from what we are doing to how we are doing it. Like, could this almost be tantamount to like the difference between like say a virtue ethics and like a deontological ethic where you're looking at like not necessarily these like categorical like say imperatives of an action like thou ought not steal to like trying to analyze what people are doing in terms of the virtue in which they are doing it. Like just to give a really kind of like down to earth example could be like my parents putting me on meds when I was young and they really did this in like the virtue of the good, right? Even though I would say like that action itself was like very bad, but they did it.
at an extended level, yeah. But I'm going to go the next level deeper. Start thinking about what we're doing when we make those statements. The next level, we start talking about the talking itself,
Yes.
which is a hard question. Like, it's a rare circumstance. Most people just talk about
Yeah,
like
meta philosophical analysis.
yeah. What even no? Well, you could say meta. I guess you could think of it that way, but it's in order to go meta, you get really personal, which is and then the meta, right, which is just generated as a secondary or tertiary process. But you do it by addressing like how we, like you and I, are thinking this shit up and what's required for us to do so. And in that becomes this recursive process we call recognition, or I am terming recognition and creating a sense of parallelism, paradigm, if you will. That's what occurs, right? The story, the pro, I like to refer to it now, right? It's obviously the story that's generated from that, and then recognizing what, like how that happens, essentially, when I'm doing it, and how that affects everything else that we do. The how affects the doing, of course. To have that conversation, it's just like where people are. It's like they've jumped ahead without doing that, or doing that a lot less. So they just go straight to the talking and not thinking about how they talk, how they're, like, and not just like the talking, like the speaking itself, like uttering the word and enunciating. No, that isn't. It just scrapes the surface of the vast complexity, right, that develops, right, as we make this shit happen right now. Wondrous. But to engage with that, with a process like that,
Hmm.
uh develops a different type of persona. I think that's where I'm generally alluding to. Like the way that you see becomes vastly more distinct, it seems, than the worlds of others, right? Because well, for me, reveals the substrate. It reveals if it was ever hidden. It's more like I've forgotten it. If I had to sympathize with anyone else, like you just are not noticing what is always occurring because it is the occurrence itself.
In a
It
sort
is.
of last time we spoke off the record, and we talked kind of about Socrates and the Socratic method of sort of like discursive revelation
Yeah,
of
self-prompting.
yeah, yeah, you can apply it to the self too. You can really sort of delve down into the own depths of like your underlying assumptions, what's undergirding your like current beliefs, and
Even assumptions, like what is it? What are we doing when we're assuming? Even that question. See, it's like just one step too high, too high, not low enough to really get at what I'm.
because our inclination, I think the reason that gives rise to the problem that you're trying to like diagnose is our knee jerk um tendency is to always take this descriptivist view when like somebody's asserting something, somebody's making a claim, or somebody's undertaking a commitment of some sort or
Everything is
other.
action. Everything's an action, and then
But what
it's
our tendency is, is to think of in this kind of correspondent way to like this descriptive account where by doing so they're not it's not assertoric, like they're not just making this assertion and then I agree 100% with what you're saying, but I want to kind of like go into why it's not the way that we are currently thinking. And people always try to think in terms of like a descriptionist account when you say, you know, uh, X is a Y or something like that. It's like you are describing a property of a thing, and the truth or falsity of that like stands or falls on whether or not that's actually the case and of that's the fact of the matter, right? Rather than sort of shifting the attention to like what a person is doing when they make certain truth claims or they take up certain stances, they bind themselves to certain like epistemic norms and commitments and things like this. And I just want to say one more thing and then I'll see if you have a response to this. But one of the ways that, and you've helped me immensely with this, and I've sort of been looking a lot into like Brandam's work, and I think there's a similar like overlap between like what you're saying and what I found there. But just take this model for how well it works as like a heuristic. So you have two senses in which you can use a language. You can apply like the English language in a sort of in an object language and in a meta language, right? And the latter goes back to what you said before. Like when we start talking about language, we start talking, de dicto, like about you move from saying Italy is a country in Europe to Italy is a 5-letter word, right? Which is sort of like an ascended way of talking. It's the latter being like rather meta. And I think most people, including like say Christians, including like even like correspondence theorists, and 90% of people like who are even into like philosophy, theology, they always think in terms of like semantic ascent. So look at the semantics and the way that we talk, the kind of like discursive ways that we engage, and then they try to look up to the higher order like linguistic norms and things like this, and then they almost have this like transcendental view where the norms, be they like grammatical, ethical, whatever, um they sort of like transcend our activities, our actions, the efficacy of like these things down on the ground. And it seems like what you want to do, and I think what Brandom definitely advocates, is a sort of semantic descent where norms, right? These meta level norms are instituted socially, socio-conventionally. Like these are conventions, and we ultimately, man is the measure, right? On this view, man is the measure. We don't discover these things, we institute them by committing ourselves to them in a way. And part of like the mechanism of doing that is we sort of transcendentalize like our truth claims and stuff like that they are, but ultimately we kind of voluntarily enter into these, the judgments of experts, for example, the judgments of like an expert mathematician who's really revolutionized the field, somebody like Hilbert or whatever. I kind of like voluntarily recognize him as being an authority and a standard. And so I will, if I want to be like a mathematician, I'm going to sort of judge myself by how well I'm able to engage with like the groundwork that he laid. Am I able to like play with his ideas and stuff like that? But ultimately, it is to be recognized that you undertake these commitments in a kind of voluntary way, and as such you kind of self bind. And when you have a community of people um engaged in this sort of like recognitive practice, like I'm recognizing as you as somebody who is in a privileged position of sort of challenging my philosophic commitments, because you've sort of shown to me a level of competence and diligence that I've sort of like opted to recognize you as somebody who's in a, whereas like my mother, for example, I wouldn't even really grant for the most part that she is in a position to like it say that I'm not good at philosophy or something of that sort. Like it wouldn't even, do you know what I mean? So that like the voluntary aspect of like recognizing norms, not just social ones, but like even the most fundamentally like syntactical norms and mathematical. um I don't know if that was like
No, and yes,
too all over the
yes. I
place, but
mean, in a way, I concur, and it's the very convention that you're appealing to now, as an example. Yeah, you're describing the situation as very it's like a passive engagement, right? That it's that you're voluntarily, right? That you're committing, so on and so forth. These are all, this is if anything, I'll describe it now as a secondary function to what is a primary one, right? When you think of recognition, it's like, well, the primer, that's what the Greeks. I don't know whether we're like, well, the way we tell it now or how they maybe intended it. I'll tell you the effect. Let's see, is that the way the word is arranged or syntactically is that the secondary, what comes after, is produced first. Right. So think when we say the word people, consider that recognition is doing it. The re is the after effect of the first one, which is the cognition, which, to me, to build, right? And you rebuild, right? That which was first produced. This is the recursion um, that seems to be developing, but failed to, but a failure to recognize that as this delay is created in this process. This thing we term now as mimetic, and this when I'm speaking, I'm trying to note the action that precedes the product. Action, reaction, right? It's like we live in a world right now that favors the delay over the act, right, that creates it, which is all that you do. Right? Everything, every sense, that very primitive notion is just that, just action, the action
I
phase.
really I really strongly align um with your stressing of the idea that we have to, rather than try to discover something that extends our knowledge, we have to just recognize these like factors that are already at play. I think too this there's a lot of notions here which are kind of like Eastern in their kind of methodologies, where it's like the Eastern school of philosophy, it's not as like analytically rigorous or voracious, but at the same time, it's like they just simply want you to recognize a fact about the way that you already engage, right? So, like, say for Buddhists, for example, it may just be recognizing the fact of like mutual codependence or like the idea of like anatman, right? No self. And if they could really get people to come around to recognizing that idea, um, it would no longer be a rational decision to like trample over, you know, a bunch of trees
Well, the,
or
well, the
you
issue
know
the issue paradox
because it's
is that
you, because there's no like real, there's no actual like
why?
firm distinction. Like I'm just saying one thing, right? I'm not
Uh-huh.
even trying to like shoehorn in like an analysis of like
No, no,
Buddhist.
I'm giving you a chance to ground it. You can
I'm
state it,
just saying
okay?
I'm just saying it's interesting how, and I agree with you, like wholly, I agree. Just the idea that you're not trying to like use some large hadron collider to like extend our knowledge and discover something out there in the world. You want to actually just course correct by like showing people, um dude, you're already doing this, but you're kind of like, and again, there's like an underlying element of like secretion philosophy, maybe Eastern philosophy. It's like you want to reveal some kind of self-awareness to the practitioner of like, no, you've already undertaken these commitments. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
You're
well,
like,
in a sense, yes, you could say that, but the way it's spoken, the sense you just made would ironically be in opposition to that. It's like there's no committing here. Right? It is the committance itself, and how like in the attempt to describe to yourself what you're doing becomes this revelation. Right? That isn't a revelation, right? It's not revealing anything as if it was ever hidden.
yes.
It just seems as if it was hidden. and it's not. So I didn't really do anything other than like other than create that concrescence, right? This where you
Yes.
look back, or you look back.
Through discursive inquiry and like this line of reasoning, you just simply revealed something that was um should have always been rather obvious
I
to a
questioned the
person.
question itself. What am I doing when I question? Probably the best question you could ever ask. Question the question. What
Yeah,
are you
I
doing
like
when you
this
inquire?
starting the first philosophy from like an open question, like Albert Camus, right? The his the only question, um the only philosophical question that matters is like whether or not to kill yourself, right? And from there, that was kind of like his first philosophy, meaning that all philosophies should build upon the answer to that question. Like if you
Wow.
turn
Okay.
your gaze inward.
You just
I'm
turned
just
your
trying
game.
to. I'm not trying at all to lump you in with any kind of
You
school.
did though. You did, and you
No, no,
did.
no, no, no. Let me.
No, no, no. I know. No, 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 no.
I'm
Yeah, yeah,
just
yeah, yes.
drawing parallels, but I'm not trying to like
I
lump
know
you
that, but
in with any
it's
kind of.
very. But you already did, and you can't say you have you didn't mean to when that's obviously going to be the result. Like think what you're doing. This is more fun. It's not like a question whether or not you should live or not. It's what a question is in of itself. Much more like foundational, right? The first model you introduced assumes that we already know what a question is in order for it to be pertinent to ask it about your life.
Yeah,
It seems a little more paramount, like critical to note that one if you're going to be a an epistemologist, right? Ground your sense of knowing. Well, you might want to ask yourself about the very thing, about the question itself, about the engagement, and see what that turns up.
I
But
think
it's
what.
vastly different than what that dude's talking about.
Mhm.
This is an entirely different domain, right? Because the domain of the question has already been assumed, which by necessity me would be a, a way to form a necessary new category. Right? I can't think of this other thing without forming one. Right? That to ask myself about life, right? I says, well, I've assumed that I'm asking at all. What does it mean to ask? What are we doing when we ask?
Yeah, you already come at it with this repertoire of all of these notions being like assumed.
Yes, smuggling as you noted. So sorry, thank you for letting me point it out, right? For smuggling in ideas here,
What
because
one of the things that I
I want to
always
talk about the smuggling. We need to discuss this act of smuggling.
what I want to do kind of is and you can still hear me, right? My sound didn't drop.
No, you're good.
Okay, I was just receiving a call, so hopefully that didn't like bog out my audio or whatever. But one of the videos I wanted to make, and I didn't get around to it, and I'm probably not going to, but maybe I can just run through some of the ideas here since it's like directly kind of relevant to what we're talking about. Is a lot of my views, like I mean, I won't go so far as to call myself a Buddhist because that entails all these different kind of like religious and esoteric like commitments and all of this that I just reject. But I found it interesting that I seemed to converge through no engagement whatsoever with like Buddhist text or anything like that. I just taking like a really Western pipeline. I seem to converge with a lot of the like core and integral like concepts of Buddhism. Not all of them, but one of them being this sort of like foundational quietism. Because I think like when you're talking, I think there's a certain like quietist undercurrent that runs through what you're advocating because even with like David Hume, for example, one of the biggest like criticisms he gets is like he's this sort of sensorial empiricist, right? Like all knowledge is derived from the senses, and therefore, like, we can't really defend the ideas of like causality, and any kind of like metaphysic goes by the wayside, and all of this. All we have is like degrees of intensity of sensa and repetition, basically, and then we model. So he's sort of like a cognitive constructivist. We've just sort of like modeled the mental out of this and this, and so we don't actually have a self in this kind of intransient way, etc. But then he went on to actually propose a philosophy which was kind of like this bundle theory. It's a little bit contradictory, that it's seemingly contradictory, because he's denying knowledge, but then he's like building a bit of a system out of that denial. And it's like, how, like, why ought we be a bundle theorist on this view? And I have like resolutions to it, but I think ultimately you just have to, there's certain kind of foundational questions that you just have to sort of maintain like a quietism about, maybe for reasons because they're not formed in the right ways, or maybe because
I think it's
there's just certain questions that aren't really, do you know what I mean?
uh yeah, I think I get what you mean.
Like Buddhists will try to
I'm
deny,
making
like,
sense of it.
for example, like like Taoism, right? They'll say like the Tao that can be named is not the Tao.
Can I
Like
ask you
that's the
a
ultimate line
a
of the
very
Taoist
simple question?
religion.
Let's walk you through this. Right, build them up.
Your mic dropped too. Your mic kind of pooped.
Is that better?
Yeah, that's great.
Okay. Yeah, let's walk through it. Okay. A quietus, right? Okay. So let's think about this. What are we quieting? Right? If there's a, let's say we're talking about a goal, like there's a sum, right? What is the sum that is no longer being sumized? And in light of like what we might assume is like somebody engaging with Buddhism, right? So let's say quietus is their solution, right, to a problem. So what is the problem, right? Well, somebody comes to Buddhism and asks, like, what is the meaning of life? Right? And their solution is shut the fuck up. that's that's your solution, right? The answer to your question is stop talking, because the answer, because to ask the question drives you crazy, right? Essentially, that's how I see it. In the
Like,
simplest of terms, the most common of terms about what's being engaged with here is someone proposing that your idea of knowledge, let's say take it to carry it over, becomes the problem. That you're assuming that there's something to know is creating a sense of a paradox where
yes,
you are noting that you have to say this, but then are automatic espousing that you're not saying it. That it's this thing that says it, and you're merely passively noting it, which is like trivializing your act of speaking, to which, right, is foundational for everything to occur. And this loop, right, of mis you could say mis self attribution, where the poser fails to integrate themselves into the model.
yes.
This is where you come to this cognitive psychological, framing, right, the storytelling, to kind of to suggest how that,
Bystanderism,
yes,
passive,
bystander,
like bystander.
yes, and the way we speak and right now it's noted. I mean, even you do it. Like this is it's a especially when we're speaking, to when others might hear us. The tendency to do this is very deeply self-induced. You could say ingrained, right? We've
Yeah, yeah, no, it is.
uh,
You have to almost be
concretized
like,
this.
I guess, a bit of a fictionalist about it, where you're like, you're refusing to abandon these notions, but you're also have acknowledged that they don't really describe things in the world or whatever. Like even David Hume, when he went out to the bar, he still said, like, get me another drink or
No,
whatever.
it's kind of
Even
fictionalist.
though he said
No,
there is no
no,
self,
there's
even though
no, no, there's no fictionalism here. Like in this model, we worry about that later. It's not a kind of fictionalism. It's noting the foundation for even the idea of fact or fiction. We need to talk that. That's the recognition of how we're doing. It's like
so
let's
let's
note what we're doing when I'm provoking those terms, when I'm making those statements.
and
When
you
I'm
say when you say note what we're doing, I agree, but I think I want to sort of like grain down and nail down what so you mean like because you could mean that in a number of different ways, like that note attitudinally what we're doing, like
well,
the
like when I say
temperament or
what,
the
those
emotional.
you're probably going to address the what statement. It's just like what to you are you referring, Sigma? Because note of some what is just a term of self. It's self prompt where I note I'm attempting to recognize, create a sense of parallelism, right? And that creates the paradigm that there is this, um, there is something to which to be concerned. To make that happen, it's an event in the Whiteheadian sense. Let's just bring him in, uh, that I create. And in that, this space arises, right, of what I'm considering. And this is the action, right? I say this. What is it? It's noting noting how I mean while I'm noting what I'm meaning. And if that confounds you, it's like, well, you don't have to worry because you're already doing it. It's really not that confounding. It just sounds weird to say it because it's not how we generally speak. Right? We speak forward, right? Like an endless set of prescriptions and proclamation statements endlessly. Right? And if we ever try to, kind of note that in parallel, it creates these statements that are not incomprehensible, but are um, queer.
One of like to maybe take a concrete example here would be like how you might address like Socrates' paradoxes, like about the ship of Theseus or something like this, which like the nominalist view kind of like um, is rooted in, I think, to an extent, like that only component parts are real, but like compositional objects are they're fake, they're fictions, they're fancies, they're something to this effect. So like if you have no essential properties of like a thing in this Aristotelian way, like a boat doesn't have an essence. It's just the deck boards and it's just the hull and the mast and stuff like this, right? And there's nothing more than that. That is just what it is. And calling it, Lucy or whatever, right? You name your boat is just sort of like a fiction or it's like a human, So then people will say like they'll ask a Buddhist who, Buddhists really would like co-sign this idea about like compositional nihilism. And they will say, then what is it? Like, why do we have such an intuitive grasp, such a strong common sense intuition that there is such a thing there as the essence of the ship, the essence of the self, the essence of, the shirt as being like a gestalt, like
Well, that's
somehow it's
what I'm
more than the
trying to
sum of
note.
its parts. And then that's where the quietist will say, like, we can't answer that question because in our model, like questions like that don't kind of like cohere. They don't make sense in our view. We have to just if I tried to answer it's like if I it's almost like if I asked you if you stopped beating your wife yet. you'd have to be a quietist about that
Well,
question. You
I
couldn't
think
say no. You couldn't
in the
say yes.
pursuit, the quietus in the like I think that's what I was trying to frame earlier. In the light of the goal, like there is no in speaking toward this thing that you'll never obtain because of what is occurring to create, right? It's pursuit, the foundation of the act itself. That's what I'm trying to draw attention to is that foundation. Like we can figure out what we are by noting how we're doing it, and it's simply this, ladies and gentlemen, that we are spontaneously generating value at a meta level. Like the meta concept is the term world, right? And whatever tongue that term is spoken in, that sentiment, that meaning. But that's essentially it, and everything from there, right? As like the ship of Theseus. Well, it's noting how we generate the notion of Theseus is by spontaneously asserting its value, and we create a world. We call it the ship, and in it, right? It's endless construction, right? As we imagine, right, the ship in that all of its value is transitory because it's being spontaneously fucking generated. It's underdeterminate because of the foundation of the spontaneous generativity. That this is happening right now and is persistently like and without un, only like within the as a requirement. How do I describe this? It can't be done otherwise.
Let me because it's I really want to sort of just like test your ideas by throwing a bunch of different theories and problematics at it and like seeing how you kind of like work through them in this model. I find it
Well,
do you
just know
find that a productive way to
you suggesting yes, very much so.
I
I'm gonna
find it productive
I'd like to preamble that in your supposition, right, what we could do says if he does it next would be requiring me to do so. He's already assumed that I'm going to spontaneously generate some value because he doesn't know what I'm going to say. Right?
yes.
So in some way, it's gonna happen somehow. But the the attribution is underdeterminate, right? And because he likely acknowledges that, which justifies the question. Boom, right? We've already got. Can anyone else notice that this is occurring right now?
And I
We don't
want
really
I
need
want to
any more than that, but more will help for sure.
and I want to also say too that it should be noted and acknowledged that this is a very difficult thing that I'm kind of doing to you right now because I'm sort of even when somebody's very kind of well acquainted with their beliefs and whatnot, applying them in this very dynamic way to like problematics that you might not have specifically thought of trying to solve with your model or whatever. And we're not rehearsed. Like we've not rehearsed any of this. I'm just sort of like really putting you in the hot seat and putting you um on the hot seat. But I find it, kind of a useful way to it's like let's apply your model to like these different problematics, these different let's try to synthesize or square them with other famous ideas that have been suggested which have kind of stood the test of time, whether they're Buddhism or Humeanism or um one thinker that I always found really fascinating, and he died recently, but even though I never agreed with much of what he said, I think just the way that he builds systems is very, very like intuitive and very, he's obviously like very good philosopher, was John Searle. And he had these really interesting like thought experiments, and he also had some very interesting books that he wrote, Philosopher of Mind, but he also worked a lot on language and semantics and stuff like this. And he sort of carved the world up into brute fact and institutional facts. So in the latter case, right, you have institutional facts where we can make epistemic claims about states of affairs that aren't like ontologically true. So something could be like that money is his go-to example of this, right? Like that I could literally say it is true that this is $20 in my pocket, or it is true that Donald Trump is the president. But it's an institutional fact. It's something that man is the sole measure of, as opposed to this sort of domain he kind of reserves for like brute facticity, like that Everest is the tallest mountain in the world. That is not something that we institute the truth of. That is a fact that we discover, that that body of rock is there and it is taller than these other, and I would push back on this, but it would just be interesting. Like, would you almost go so far as to say that all facts are like institutional facts? That would be my view, I think. I even think that the idea that Everest is the tallest mountain, it kind of functions the same way as saying like Trump is the president.
Yeah, institutional, founded in you could say constitution, personal constitution, which is that every person has to uphold that idea, who becomes, a part of that uh, convention. Which is me appealing to every, like, in a very personal way, to anyone who engages, like, say, with academia. It's like, well, its value is upheld with you, brother, and it can't be done otherwise. So whatever authority you bestow it, right, is always with that consideration. I'm willing to, like, just recognize that, for, you know, well, for necessity, I can ground that all the way down to, all the way down to my metaphysic, you'd say, or personal physic. Um, but I feel like that's not, it's not so even like spoken about. Like, even in your description right there, it's like there's layers, like this, all this smuggled in framing that isn't addressed, right? It's like, yeah, like the world, like the Everest to be there, yeah, you have to uphold that the person has to assume that you're speaking with, right? Assuming you're recognizing that there's just a single person at any given time reading your fucking book, and that from their perspective, you're imagining they're trying to, form a relationship with you. And in this, you're supposing of a place called as Everest, which is theirs too, right? You're supposing that they're supposing, and this is our supposition, the supposing of supposition itself.
Searle makes the boldest move I think that you can make in philosophy, period. And he denies the PSR, or like the principle of sufficient reason, that everything which exists, everything which happens, happens in lieu of a cause that's sufficient to make it happen, right? Like there's a cause for every effect, there's a cause for every, like, and he denies this in order to kind of carve out his realm of brute fact, where I remember he makes this in one book he makes this example of like the relationship between the inner ear fluid and your ability to balance and walk straight. And he's like, it just is the case. There's no further reason for it, because he's like, I'll give you one more example before you respond, just to really illuminate this point. Because he's like, no matter how much you delve down into like the interrelationship between inner ear fluid and proprioception and balance, you're eventually just going to run into this brute fact that's just the way the fuck it is, period. Like, and there's no more like explanatory, or sufficient reason. And another one, he says, the fact that when you construct like computer hardware in such and such a way, you put the battery here, you have the copper wiring is like this, and the cord runs to the wall and blah blah blah. You just get the YouTube app. There it is. Like
Ooh, yeah.
it
This is
just
a
there's no more explanation. Like you're like, but why? But why? But like, and he's like, it's just a brute fact at a certain point that you arranged the motherboard this way, and there it is. There's the software. There's the hardware, then the software emerges.
yes.
And you see how this starts to get into his like philosophy of mind, right? But I'll
Yeah.
leave that
Well, well,
for the
he's
moment.
already. I think that's a great point, dude. I mean, here's another set of smoking concepts, things that even I have mentioned, but now need to directly assess, which is when I speak of we, when I say like we are making it up, often people will probably assume that the category we, contains an operative or a collection of eyes, right? A sense of individuals, right? Perspectives, right? Isomorphs. This is an issue, right? Because it notes like when I say dictate, like let's say where I say we're making it up, right? Which is a sense of dictation, right? Of generativity and act, right? There's a sense of will, and in that, this concept becomes generic and perhaps necessarily so, kind of monolithic, because it's just one word, one category, right? A wholeness is essentially kind of simply assumed. But in that, from the discussion, like when we say like we dictate is the I, right, is in contrast to the dictate, right? So I dictate the thing, I give it meaning, I make the meaning, right? There's the maker and the made. The suggestion is that looking at the framing too, right, as we do this as co-substantiational, that the pro the producer and the product are conjured at the same time. There's no one before the other. This is where, and so to kind of note the provisional provocational nature, right, of our experience, that when I name things, that the I is also aggregate, like it's collective, it's aggregational, right? It's all, and that from this forms this sense of wholeness, this one to which we form this greater conversation. We assume that this sense of I, and that which dictates and that was dictated to, is like an already established framing. But I'm going to suggest to you to think that that process has never really been fully established. It has just been an ongoing tendency that we do. But that sense of I is is still like spontaneously generating relation relationship, and within that the sense of uh, identity, and that process ongoing because it's developmental, right? Just like the story of you is a complexifying one, right? Starts simple and becomes more complex, right? And that's all that you know. You could say all that is obvious, and with that, um, this sense of delay between you, but like between the act, right, and between the act and the reaction, right? But it's all action. It's the same in delay. And so that's the sense of self, right? Like when the guy says, "Oh, it is what it is," like Mount Everest, like let's steelman him, like, "Oh, it'll imagine it'll be there, and it's probably there," and so on and so forth, standing right at the highest point. I've never been to it. Like say, I could never been to it directly, and so on and so forth. But these are all just senses of delay that I'm applying to that concept, that I'm inducing, that I'm making, and that the mountain, right, or any phenomena, any physicality, is always like attributed to that. I've just created a sense that there's like this, that what that is doing is different than what I'm doing. I'm suggesting the mountain, right, and I are both spontaneously generating, right, the notion of each other simultaneously. And you still keep, like I suppose, like kind of capture or hold that underdeterminacy, right, the world of knowing, but also embrace like a sense of mutual provocation, right? That it's not just like the sense of you versus the world, like you define it, that the you is defined by the world, by that sense of we, which is how I speak. So not probably less obviously noted when others are hearing me talk about it, right? They're going to assume that I also think of myself as like isolated or singular, when it's like in a in a sense, but not definitely not in the same sense. To me, it's like it's positional, right? It's always actionary, the sense of one, the sense of identity, and with that, how I build the relationship, like the sense of attribution, attempting to explain things, um, or even create that sense of factuality, like that something would persist beyond me. Is just noting that even the sense of me was already something that was never contained. Like the sense of the mountain, right? Like when you interact with it, it's like okay, it's there. If I said it wasn't there, I'd still feel it. Well, it's just like one noting that even that your sense of view has been embedded as like it arises from from what is already an assumed matrices. That's kind of how we think about it, right? The mountain and you were already kind of in parallel, and then this process of defining, right, the relationship between a man and the object, right, forms from what is already an assumed manifold, shared manifold. I'm just saying that manifold as we imagine it, stability is imminently occurring. That all of this is right now actively being developed. And all that's being developed, like a sense of time, space, and time, is an endeavoring sense of delay, which embraces a lot of like interesting concepts from other domains like quantum physics and particle theory, right? So on and so forth, right? All these worlds of ambiguous relationships, right? Fields and trajectories and rotations. The least amount of specificity is described at these levels. I'm just like willing to embrace that very conceptualization is the real is in a form of realization of it. That the world we imagine, right, that's always occurring, that we're part of that.
I always just to kind of like veer off of maybe slightly, but I was talking to somebody the other day on this app, and they were like very much knowledgeable about science in this very interior way, right? Not like they lack the ability to kind of situate the scientific enterprise within like a historiographic context or anything, but they know a lot about like physics and biology and stuff like that, in the way that like you would be taught in high school. Like they would have passed all the classes, right? Not the meta, but like the object level analysis of like physical domain and physical theory and stuff like this. And I think it kind of stems back to like something in childhood. I had a bit of a conversation with him, and I said, I never really understood science. Like, I didn't have much interest in it when I would learn it in school because my interests were always very rational rather than empirical. So I always wanted to kind of turn the scope inward to like forget about like the facts of science and the knowledge that it posits and everything. Like, what are the preconditions for knowledge to obtain? How do I know that I know a thing? And this is kind of like the a priori in a Kantian sense. Like, before you even know anything, like what kind of concepts, what kind of conceptual norms must you already sort of have in your repertoire? And so he, had the idea of like a priori knowledge, like prior to experience, any kind of knowledge, whatever it may be, has to take this certain type of logical epistemic form, like the deductive syllogism, or like let's say all men are bad, all marry Socrates is mortal, all men are mortal, therefore Socrates is a man, like this, right? Like you could strip this down, without even having any kind of input specified. All A's or B's, all B's or C's, all A's or C's, things like this, right? And that was sort of like, I don't know. I always had a very philosophy brain and I never understood science because I always figured that, like, once we understood enough about, like, the enterprise of, like, human reasoning about science, like, let's not look at what is being reasoned about, but let's look at how we reason and things like this. That, like, eventually the former would just kind of fall into place. Do you know what I mean? So
Oh,
I
yeah.
was always much more, and I understand that this is like a simplistic view, and uh that neither of these are like necessarily good like routes to take, but I would stay like working in that classical philosophic paradigm of
I
like,
don't think you can. I don't think you can. And I think
but
this
I'm
is
just
where
saying I'm just saying, like, for the sake of brevity, that, like, people would have described me as like much more of a rationalist than an empiricist, like much more of a Cartesian, where I was like, forget about the world, right? Like, look inside, like, turn the gaze toward the, the res cogitans, and like, look at what you're doing. Look at, before you pontificate about like scientific results and scientific inquiries and stuff. Like, look at like what inquiry is.
see there's the problem, as you said before. This is all this. This is very difficult to speak about because you can't. There's no like even to think in pretense. Like notice what you're noticing. Notice what you're noting. How you're noting. Like even to speak in that way, like, to have conversations um, with that type of immediacy, which is where there's still like an expectancy of like something to happen, but it's like being in that moment, right? Of just the expecting, what we're doing when we're expecting, when we're presuming or predicting, like even in like how you spoke about like that we're like understanding, like there's this idea of anticipation that's being applied, that's being produced, and how that's occurring, and from there an entire complex of the world. That's why I come back and I say the description like a spontaneously generating value. That notion to me, in the sense that I make with it, is incredibly comprehensive because it notes even after that like the idea of memetics, like why has this occurred, how is this occurring, this disassociation in a system that is self-generating, how does it produce the illusion of a self, you could say, create a disassociation within association. And this it makes great sense, like why we've forgotten, you could say, ourselves, right, in creating the notion of ourselves, like lost sight that of how we're doing it, which is this omni, like I say, it's not just internal, like there's an internal world, but it's attributed in all, to me, in all directions simultaneously, the inside, the outside, the forward, the backwards, the the to and the from, all simultaneous and all like I use the term maximizing or expanding, scaling, but in that sense of scale, the idea of, well, it just keeps on going. I'll never get done talking because it's happening now. How to have that conversation, and then the way we speak, like you talk about like convention, like utilizing the conventions, like um, making it easier for people to talk about. I don't think there is. I think the way we talk about it is making it harder to note this. That there's no way to use the convention against itself in order to, other than to recognize, which is what I did, to recognize its failure, that it doesn't produce what it espouses.
Yeah,
It becomes a useful
it fails by its
thing.
own measure.
fails by its own measure, and from there it fails because then I recognize what I'm doing when I was
It
attempting to
fails by
measure.
the standards that have been set within the system. Like it's not even
It fa-
failing according to some external like locus of judgment. It's failed by a kind of internal like
yes,
inability to
it's
live up
failed
to
to
its own purported aims.
yeah, yes, it's failed to even
Yeah.
establish the boundary of external. Like where, like I don't even know the internal, external. What the fuck? Like, I'm having an issue here with this concept that I've been able to establish any of those worlds with any finitude, right, and any absoluteness to assert that anything can be produced after that notion. But that's what's lost in the delay, right? In the
Hmm.
as the system self generates, it's kind of like, well, imagine like an Ouroboros, but the snake keeps getting longer and never actually grabs the end of its tail.
I think we fundamentally agree on everything here. I don't have any issue or take issues with any of the things you're saying. Um, Again, I think we just have very different methods of like presentation, different modes of presentations, and I think yours is more to just sort of like go forth and present the model and argue for it as
I
a
don't think there's
kind
a
of
way to
like
do it. There's no argument. I can't make an art. I can't even appeal to art because there's no debating what a debate is made of. It can't be debated. It can't be refuted. There's no way to do it.
yeah, yeah, it's like an airy gas or something. Like it's sort of gaseous in a certain way. Like again, and sorry if it's like abrasive to you. I'm gonna keep just sort of like um
It feels that way because when I'm
I'm
asking,
sort of gonna just keep juxtaposing like a sort of like a
well,
against
can
this
I
like
can I steel man you?
Buddhist background. Okay, go ahead, go ahead.
The steel man is where the reason it would seem amorphic because I'm not giving you an idea to hold on to. Right? It's not a thought. It's not going to be a picture in your mind. Right? As we imagine definition, like a word, like it means something because we imagine like the symbols in our mind, right? Like run,
Yeah,
RUN, boom. Okay, thing. This I'm not no like no, it's not about the word itself. It's about the process which is already occurring, and that's the anchorage. The anchorage is ambiguous because that's what your life is.
it
It's an
already
endless.
presupposes, yeah, like it already presupposes this whole architecture of like normative structure. It's like architectonic in a way.
Well, the structuring, the process of.
I keep kind of wanting to, and it's because I was just sort of primed to make this video, so I was sort of like thinking a lot about Buddhism and like where I depart and where I converge with it and stuff. So I want to keep, I find it helpful to like sort of keep trying to shoehorn it into this conversation for the sake of like contrastive analysis.
Well,
But
the relatability, right? Which I think was germane in Buddhist thought for me, which is noting that I think they're addressing the question. Like I said, I thought of it like that. Like some Westerners coming to Buddhist
credit
thought
where it's due,
asking,
they're sort of like placed closer to what you're saying than like something like fucking Islam for sure.
yes, I think maybe
Of
in a
course.
maybe a cruder way that they were noting like, well, the notion of knowledge is your ego. You're building your sense of self, which is an
Yes.
obsession, right? And so to relieve yourself of this upset and the torment that's coming from your lack of knowing that this is all that it is you just building that notion, uh, and you're never going to capture the thing that you're always making up. Then just to let go of the process. That's their solution. Right? I'm noting that, well, instead of giving up that there is no self, like or the abandonment of self, to just reconciling that you is an endeavor and will be wondered by the endeavor, which is the different than framing. So just said
Hmm.
where they were really useful and kind of embracing as if they were addressing that proverbial question, right? Don't ask the question, right? Or in the Sigma's case, note what you're doing when you're asking the question, which is spontaneously supposing and anticipate and you're creating an
Descend back
anticipation.
down to descend back down to the ground level.
yeah, creating this, anticipating a greater value, which is what, like, if
Instead
you
of
think about
instead of a transcendental view, you're almost advocating like descended view, or descended, sorry, descended view, rather than a transcendent view.
no, not an ascendant, right? That it's all development. It's all like think. I'm going to try and say this now, but please don't try not to interrupt me because it's gonna. I haven't done this before.
Yeah, yeah, go ahead.
Right? Is the in spontaneously generating value is another sense of saying it is to build this anticipation of future value. Right? That's how a self-generating system, which would only have itself would to me generate the value. It's what makes the most sense to do that, to prehend endlessly your own value over and over again, creating the sense of that delay, like in knowing, right? That you produce this notion, but just say, hey, it's just I'm just extending it further, right? Create than what we might call the immediate, right? Versus the imminent, right? Create the everything immediately happening, and then from that create the sense of imminency, right? Endlessly, and the more we create it, the more space time and so on and so forth is produced. But it changes the whole model, right? It's like notes from the Buddhists is they've assumed that that there's already a problem, right? That we are endlessly going to try and do this, and the only way to stop this torture, right? This endless self justification is just to stop justifying your own life. And it's like I don't see this as a problem at all. It's like, yeah, it's contentious because it's constantly being made up, right? And ad libbing, bootstrapping, right? And as you imagine, like that sense of chaos, it's chaotic in a sense because it has only itself to turn to for its stability. And having to ad lib that every moment, right, as an ad lib is a spontaneously generative event, so would to this relative instability, right? Which, because before, if you imagine a no state, there wouldn't even be a sense of stability, let alone instability. There's no reference at all, incomprehensibility. So chaos arises from order. That's how I note it.
Yeah, I
The
think
more
one of
ordered
the
you
interesting
become, the
things,
more chaotic the system, right?
one of the things that I found interesting by asking, like, kind of posing a bit of like a Buddhist line of inquiry to a lot of like the less inundated people that I would talk to, people that aren't like philosophy brains or whatever, mostly a lot of these people who would listen to me or you are dealing with like the woman question, which is like a subset of like sociology or whatever. But it's always about, how do you get this? How do you get this? How do you get what you want? How do you get what you want? But then the Buddhist might ask, like, wouldn't you rather just not want that though? Like the problem persists because you want to like acquire a thing, and you're having like an inhibit, but like shouldn't in principle, at least, like I'm not even saying give up your wants and desires and go become a monk, right? But I'm just saying, can't you at least acknowledge that um the want is sort of the problem? And this is where they sort of get, as soon as you desire something, even if it's knowledge, even if it's something wholesome or something humble or whatever, you kind of fall back into like dukkha. They simply want to like not, they want to not want. And um um what was that Nietzsche quote? I'm gonna butcher it, and I should know this by heart
No,
because it
you're
was like
great,
his most
dude.
famous
I
quote.
think
But
if
he said man
if
would rather take the void as his aim than to be void of aim. And that was his like critique of Buddhism, which I think is kind of sound too. Like he turns it back on the Buddhist and is like, yeah, okay, but you guys desire to like not desire, and ultimately you're still like in a state of dukkha. You're just kind of coping and seething in a way. with your quietism, because he said, again, like, to reiterate, like, man would rather have the void as his aim than to be void of aims, right?
Yeah,
Classical,
yeah,
like, Nietzschean prose, but, like,
that's a great
but
one.
there's there
I like that.
and fuck Buddhism, but there's something so important about it that needs to
I think what
really
I'm
be
trying to note, could
appreciated
you say it
too.
maybe differently? Maybe there's like noting who they're talking to. You have to think of it that way. They're speaking to someone who already has like a set of presumptions, right? This is my story to you, to someone that I think is listening in this way, and their addressments seem to be like under that model. For those of you who has already assumed this way of thinking, right, that there is an answer or someone to know or someone you really are, that it's the question itself that's the problem. Reframe the question and you may produce a different solution, essentially, is I think a more robust, right, a more nuanced interpretation of what they're noting, right, in the light of the goal that's being addressed, that's being assumed, as they're seeking someone who's come with a very particular question, and with that, a very particular set of assumptions. It's like, well, if you just remove the idea of yourself, like in isomorphic sense, right, that if it's developmental, right, which means you, okay, so you're not seeking an absolute answer, you're just embracing what you're doing by asking the question, and in that you resolve. To me, you embrace the no state, which is the liminal world. It's not a place of nothing, right? Well, in referencing those who are seeking something, it notes a making, which changes how we engage, like how we frame this in the conversations. All of that would drastically be altered, as it has for me. Why you note that the way that I speak is often queer? Because it's, well, yeah, it would be, because it would ambiguate the question, or like, well, in a sense, ambiguate, acknowledge the ambiguousness of the question, and within that, create a more coherence.
Certain questions wouldn't cohere on your view because they're like they're like integrally a part of that old kind of philosophic ruse which you've already kind of set out to delegitimate. So then to turn around and to just repose the question
Well,
is
the question itself, the questions themselves, kind of maybe implicitly note a
this is a really
decoherence.
deep point. This is a really deep point to like kind of touch on. It gets into like the fundamental nature of like um cognitive paradigm shifts where like one of the key features of the paradigm shift is that like certain old questions, those old problematics that featured prominently in like previous paradigms, they don't, it's not like they find answers in the new paradigms. They get sort of like waved off as like these types of questions like shouldn't have been asked. They were part that they were asked in this kind of like misconceptual way. And so they don't even find resolution. They just get dissolved as we sort of adopt like a new paradigm. But then the people will, obviously, the problem is that people who don't, maybe they're not quite smart enough or like charitable enough to realize what's occurred, is they'll basically say that because you're not willing or able to engage with or resolve these problems that they're posing, that this somehow like undermines your position. But the thing is that like not all questions are well formed, and the idea of like a question being well formed and like um warranting a substantive response or whatever is, it's sensitive to like the whole surround of like your doxastic commitments, your beliefs, and your whatever, right? The like the holistic level of the framework that you're operating in, and all the pretenses that you're operating in. Certain questions just they don't
I would say how
like
we
certain.
question is an issue here. Yeah, it is a question of how we question, and some questions may we may create them in a way that um, makes them less effectual by it's again like maximizing their delay, where the recognition, like the recursiveness of that, where the poser recognizes their proposition can reoccur, right? Can circle around, right? Can come about, but it doesn't. It just endlessly like
Yeah,
it just like extends outwardly. It delays um, away from its own product, essentially.
let me make one last point here before
Right?
we shift on to something else. One of the reasons that like one of the big blows I think that was dealt to philosophy by what I'll call meta philosophers like Dewey and Rorty was that they challenged the idea of like previous, philosophical giants like Kant, Descartes, etc. That there are these kind of timeless philosophical problems that every system must address if it is to be a system at all, or if it is to be worthy at all. And they sort of reserve the ability to what I'll call like turn their back and walk away. You don't like we may just shift into a new kind of linguistic paradigm or a new scientific paradigm where like we didn't answer the old questions about like say why gravity is like weaker than the other
No, it
forces or
reframed
something.
questions themselves. If I
Yes,
might, when I
yes,
think,
yes, yes,
may say it simply, it's simply is that imagine for those
yes.
who are listening right now. I think I said this in a couple of maybe a
Thank you
presentation or two back.
yeah.
You're, you're welcome.
Yeah,
Uh,
what did you say? Reframed the question such that
reframe
it
the
doesn't,
question.
such that that no longer features as a problem. And this is sort of the end of philosophy, like in the old, rigid, traditional way that like kind of existed from like the time of Socrates to the time of Kant or whatever, right? If I could read, would you mind if I read a paragraph, or would it might throw you off?
No, go ahead. I just wanted to add on. Think of it. What I'm proposing is that the trilemma that I mentioned a couple casts ago. Um,
Your audio's chopping.
all right, the trilemma that I mentioned a couple
Perfect.
casts ago is imagine that's that could be a new paradigm where those dilemmas are become the framing from what is now the contemporary. So imagine the way it's talked about now, and that being seen as a problem now becomes the solution because it's what's noted from those who are let's say on this potentially other side where the trilemma is now the solution to the problem by noting that the way things were being questioned created the notion of the trilemma. That the trilemma became a problem from a mimetic process of misattribution, right? That a
Yes.
sense of delay is created in this process, misattributing the producer from itself, which is us, right? And so we create this notion of knowledge and uh, data in the contemporary sense as a compensatory mechanism, as a way to restabilize ourselves. For those of us who recognize this, it becomes the trilemma, right, and all this supposes that this is the foundation of all that's being considered now becomes like no longer a problem. It becomes, oh, no wonder we thought this
Yeah.
because this is um the manifold.
I think Sigma, I think one of the biggest problems that we have is that we are sort of operating in an entirely different paradigm that's like not exhaustive and it's overlapping with like the paradigm that other people you may encounter online or whatever might be operating within. And there's this tacit assumption that the problematics are sort of like um irrelevant or like the problematics that any philosophic model must set out to address are universal. But that's not the case because baked into the philosophic model that somebody um, propounds to adhere to or whatever, it actually sets out as a feature of it, like what it deems relevant. What, like, do you know what I mean? And so I'll read a quote. I think that's sort of, this is from The Structure of a Scientific Revolution by Thomas Kuhn. He called Picking Up the Other End of the Stick. So if you'll allow me, he says, during the transition period, there will be a large but never complete overlap between the problems that can be solved by the old and by the new paradigm. But there will also be a decisive difference in the mode of solutions. When the transition is complete, the profession will have changed its view of the field, its methods, and its goals. One perceptive historian viewing a classic case of a science's reorientation by paradigm shift recently described it as picking up the other end of the stick, a process that involves handling the same bundle of data as before, but placing it in a new system of relations with one another by giving them a whole different framework. Others who have noted this aspect of scientific advance have emphasized its similarity to a change in visual gestalt. The marks on a paper that were first seen as a bird are now seen as an antelope, and vice versa. That parallel can be misleading. Scientists do not see something as something else. Instead, they simply see it. We have already examined some of the problems created by saying that Priestley saw oxygen as dephlogisticated air. In addition, the scientist does not preserve the gestalt subject's freedom to switch back and forth between ways of seeing. Nevertheless, the switch of gestalt, particularly because it is today so familiar, is a useful elementary prototype for what occurs in full-scale scientific paradigm shifts. So what he's describing there to me is almost like a principled incommensurability. Like when we're operating within different philosophic paradigms, we're not even able to kind of ask the same questions or ascertain the same type of things all the time. Of course, sometimes you are, but sometimes certain moves aren't even permitted. But it's hard to get people to recognize this fact, right? When incommensurability is occurring between, like, say, a Christian and like, if a Christian just tells you, right, you're a heretic and you're going to go to hell, he's sort of just kind of stonewalled the conversation because you don't even believe in those concepts. So they're not even trying to, like, necessarily appeal to any kind of like commonly held beliefs in order to like make their condemnations or make their concessions to you. They're just sort of hunkering down in their paradigm and they're like, we're not going to give up our do you know what I mean? And there's no way to
Yes.
like tell them that they're wrong. There's no way to really like show them as being in error because they don't even appeal to the same um web of beliefs. Like you can't actually disprove their entire, because you would only be able to do so from the vantage point of like your epistemic standards and your like logical precepts and stuff, but they don't
Well,
even share those, so it's literally just like a call to violence or it's some
well,
kind of
that's
stalemate.
that may be in other circumstances, except for I think this one, because the manifold in which I'm suggesting, right, the recognition, is something that they're already engaged in. For me, it's a sine qua non, right? It's without which not I've hit proverbial bedrock of what's required for me to do everything that I'm doing here now, and noting that I can't assume that someone else is doing otherwise because the manifold of that assumption is also doing that. So it's perfect. It's perfectly coherent. And from that, it's like, well, like to steelman you to say like, well, why the difficulty is because somebody who's already in this tendency, who's already asserting a goal that they'll never reach, is the conundrum, right? Like that's the horror, right? The horror of witnessing this is that someone is already doing as I'm doing. They're already making it up, right? In the sense of we, right? Say it's contiguous in nature. That's ever developing, always overlapping, so on and so forth, right? It's worlds upon worlds, and they're not aware. They're less aware of that than I am. It's already happening, yet they haven't noted it in the way that I'm noting it. Is the only differential between us, and that what I suggest is that this is, or if this is already the case, then the tendency to trick ourselves out of it, that's the novelty, right? We can kind of key in on, right? Something like, oh, what if we just did that less? Which is how I figured I've done it, right? Is that I just didn't commit, as is the requirement, to these conventions, because that's all that's holding them together is this endless endeavor of commitment, not noting that what's required for them to commit to it at all, and then that, which is the paradox, where the miscommunication, right? It's like where I become confounded. It's like, how do you not noting what you're already doing? And well, because it's more elaborate, right? It's not just as simple that just to say that is to invoke that, an entire another set of worlds that I have to build about who this person is, right? And the complexity of that narrative, right? And all of these, as it's endlessly compounding, but not incomprehensibly so, right? Not like disorientingly so. Like I can imagine a variety of circumstances that would more greatly compel someone to uh, out of this willful disregard, which is what it's become. Right? It's at some point, it's so simple to say that, like, and the willfulness is elaborate, right? It's not like that. That's where the complexity is, but still, it can be noted in that simple fashion, right? Just to reorient them to desist in this tendency to disregard is, well, it's easy to imagine. When you think about like how you get someone who's doing something you don't want to do, well, you that that sense of directness is that the provocation is you're going to turn up the volume, right? You're going to exert more force, uh, in order to, you know, make the change, which is what kind of how we discuss things sometimes, in a more, regular fashion. Right? Talk about politics and things like this, how we, quote unquote, negotiate or coordinate our efforts here, right, to build this world. But like the shift into this world, like to steelman that is that recognition. Can that become more common? I think it is common at a certain stage of development, like early on in our lives. This is how we're already operating, and that we have kind of trick ourselves, we said, out of this by creating, this this sense of delay. But the stories, right, and the environment compounded can exaggerate this sense of delay to the point where you basically feel kind of cut off in multiple dimensions, and persistently. It's not like any of those dimensions are ever finalized. It's just this endless tendency. to the point where we imagine, right? Our complex has developed into imagining of death, the ultimate sense of delay, is it not? From what is a very immediate situation, right? But
Going
it's a
to
result. Say that again.
yep, finish that point. Yeah.
Oh yeah, yeah, oh, just yeah, and that we construct these narratives that kind of encapsulate that, that sense of encapsulation, persistent over time, right? Uh, Satisfied, in symbology, literature, theatrics, stuff like that. Right? As like an echo, right? As enhancing the sense of delay, because every time you watch the movie or right, you read the book or the passage, it just reaffirms it over and over again, right? Like something spoken, creating like an echo, an echo, an echo, an echo, and the reverb, you could say, is the coherency that's created, right? And other dimensions, even in the quantum world, is described this way. Is essentially that's what a particle is as a feedback loop, right? Of reverberation. Well, so too is our memory. It seems, but for what is a very immediate production, right? Action, which is the noting, if you will. Fucking music theory, man. It's embedded. It's so obvious now. I don't know if the way I'm saying it is as titillating
No, it's
for
brilliant.
me here to. Well, shit, dude. It's we did this together. But fucking you guys, right? Collective and his, playing
People won't
guitar and the
understand.
rest of it.
People won't really understand what we're saying for the most part unless they're already sort of inculcated in like semantics and like a little bit of semantics theory. But it's you're definitely like right over the target with what you're saying for sure. I'm going to step outside for a minute, so let's take like a 2 minute sort of just intermission. I'm just gonna have smokes while I talk to you.
Yeah,
You got time still, right? You're good.
yeah. That's what I'm doing. Smoking right now.
All right, I'm just gonna throw my winter coat on and go sneak out to the garage. But so I'm gonna just be quiet for like 2 minutes.
All right.
Give you a minute to sort of digest.
Yeah. Think about it. Maybe I'll just talk personally. Might be a while since you guys hear us talk again. Who knows, right? Feels like there will be that sense of delay that I create, that we create. Um, yeah, that personal part is very instrumental. I feel like it's worth noting because how it affects how we talk about it. Like I can almost like anticipate like the criticisms that would come. Right? People thinking like, oh, you say we're just making it up, and it's like, yeah, man, the sense of me is like, how do I describe? How do I? Oh, relate the sense of urgency, and that concept to me is is very much like constructive, and that sense of many, right? Like in my tag, like as one together we make way. Well, this is me, and that centralizing aspect, which I didn't even isn't like, I guess like the oneness, right? That in that I tried to entail it in the phrase is implied, noted, but also the ambiguousness, right? Which is how it ends, the me way, we make way, just kind of allude to that. And if you're holding that sense of self like that framing, that phrase is the encapsulation, then from there, this is how I build the discussion. And then think about all of you, right, as th- another version, right, of that phrase in an endless phrasing made up of the same phrase, right, and so on and so forth. That same sentiment that I tried to convey to you with it. Hopefully that you're making similar sense and noting how you're making sense when you do it. Because I really truly can't imagine otherwise. And the utility that may come, that for me comes with that, which is to justify, like, that at some point, that sense of ethic, like, how do I do? Well, since you know how you're doing, right, your endeavor to maximize and create the sense of coherency and stability, cooperation, all these, very ambiguous sentiments, but, you narrow them down to very specific contexts, as you do it, as you ad lib the fuck out of it. Um, because even going to work, right, and doing your job in your sequenced and protocoled manner is very much ad lib at times, right? To work specifically when things come in at a precise moment. None of it's ever like exact, like it just has some measure of exactitude, and that's enough for us to keep doing it. And it's fucking awesome, and I love it. You know, and that our pursuit of detail will likewise be enduring. I hope you're cool with that, because I'm quite wondered by it all, since it's all just imminently occurring every moment. Right? As mundane as things can that I've made things seem, that we've made things seem, they're quite spectacular if you can decrease your sense of delay. And that's, I guess, that sentiment of living in the moment, being in the
When
moment
you
for me.
say delay, do you mean like temporal or does it have like a different connotation
Oh no, I mean that in the
in like a
general, like
temporal, like a
spatial, spatial temporal, both those together. Yes, distance, scale, geometry, measurement, all of these are just creating a sense of delay. And what is an immediate concern, which is like embracing the paradox in the negative sense to a paradox in the positive sense. Yes, just like the comprehensive, like it makes the most sense that it's always sensing, right? And not in the
this
passive
is a
sense, but
little
sensing
this
in
is
the
a
active.
little bit of a this is a little bit of like a side point that has nothing to do with what we're talking about. But there's this old famous like wives' tale, I guess, about Martin Heidegger. When he would give lectures, he would have this whole class before him, and he would probably a first year class, and he would construct this philosophic model of reality or whatever, like very elaborate, very, he would bring out all the rhetorical tools. He would construct this entire like body of work, and then he would immediately commence to deconstructing the whole thing. He would rip it apart, pull it apart, debunk it, all this right before their eyes. And he said, like, the students would just sort of be in awe because they were just like, he had just sort of like enamored them with this process of like, they were like, yeah, that's it. He's got it. Oh my God, that answered like every question I had. It aligns with all of my intuitions. It's like it was like that was my belief system. He had like compelled me, convinced me, he had sold me on it. And then he turns around and is like, and this is it fails. This is why it's untenable. It's unworkable. It's not salvageable. Blah blah blah. And he said he would just believe people like dumbstruck by doing this. And I know it's kind of a relevant point to make, but like I wonder if you have any like if that inspires any like thoughts in you about anything.
Yeah,
Just the fact that that's
yeah.
possible. I found that so much with my own beliefs. Like I'll get on the hype train. I'll be like, oh man, there's this school of thinkers that's not that well known, but like they had these
It generates
totally
greater
different
worlds.
ideas.
That's awesome. It's addictive, dude. That's, yeah. Oh, nothing more could make more sense than that. That generic sentiment. That, yeah, you're just expanding a notion, right? The world has achieved, you created greater coherency. Right? And even if it's just temporarily, it still feels, it makes sense, which is all that you want to do. Is just keep making sense in every domain. I meant in the cognitive thought, logic, so shit like that, but in the sensorious, right? The somatic, all I see is just an endless, and then and whatever representation, where you could say like presentation, we make of it is just another theme on that, right? Which is like reproduction, like you having a child. What have you done? You just made another person. What's another person? Another person that thinks about making more people, right? It's just
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
it's
Do you think this? Do you think I almost was like toying with the notion that philosophy almost kind of comes down to like a type of salesmanship. I know Paul Feyerabend had like themes like this in his like philosophy of science, where like he took a real like deep look at Galileo and the kind of like rhetorical devices he would use to shift the question rather than answer it. He would sort of like create instead of answering questions in this forthright way, he would sort of like pose new ones that no longer like grant coherence to the old problematics and stuff. And a lot of it was like this guy was incredibly charismatic and he would engage in like a sort of like scientific salesmanship of sorts, and like this kind of like sociologizes epistemology in a certain way.
I
Like that the
agree.
scientific
You gotta be
enterprise is
charming.
like somehow social, like it's like science is like somehow a subset of like sociology or something like that.
Well, no, it's occupying many different
Psychology.
like different domains and dimensions simultaneously. So it's got to be able to affect all those at the same time. Right? I mean, at least, or at least be maybe that's the how we measure the affect and whether or not it can. Right? That's the idea of like it hits you in your bones. Like I felt it inside. Something about that idea really like is undeniable to me at every level.
But
So
then
yeah,
it starts to kind of level out where you're like, I can really conceive of all of these counter arguments for why my beliefs might not describe reality in the correct way or whatever. And so then every belief, every idea that you advocate for or put forth, you always have to qualify it by like acknowledging your tentativity in your commitment to these ideas, because you're like, these are very provisional, and like if X were to be shown to be the case, this would undermine um my current commitments in such a way that it would knock them over. They wouldn't really be able to weather such a confutation or whatever, you know. So it's like, I don't know, the idea, like I think people have this idea, like a naive view of facticity, where facts are, they're knowable entirely irrespective of like any kind of psychological or sociological considerations or any kind of even valuative
oh no,
considerations.
they're beyond consideration itself, right? If it were to be the truest fact, right? Stillman, right? That it could never be deposed, it could never be argued against. It doesn't even need to be agreed to because it
Yeah, like
stands
it's
alone.
recalcitrant. Like it's recalcitrant, meaning like it's sort of it's disagreeable to the facts, like in a certain way that like um Christians, a lot of them are like fideists, like fideism, um, where some of them will kind of, they appeal to like revelation and stuff as the basis of their foundational commitments. Not all of them do this. There's like natural theology where people will try to argue for like intelligent design theories based on, you know, sacred geometry, or they'll use transcendental arguments. But a lot of the Christians just totally give this up, and they say it's beyond, it's beyond logic and reason, and it's something like felt in the heart or whatever. And so it's recalcitrant in that it's not even clear at that point what you could even present to them which would constitute like a counter to their position. Do you know what I mean? Like it doesn't even permit falsification in the first place.
Yeah, I mean that's not a Stillman. That's not a bad foundation because it's like, well, what I'm appealing to, would be beyond assuming the other person, right, has a similar experience, would be beyond contestation. Right? How do you deny a feeling?
They would just
Can't.
keep saying, like,
Right?
in an attempt to kind of rationalize their view, like, to drag them out into the light, into this kind of like supposed neutral arena where you could like subject their views to these like overarching criteria of validity or whatever warrantability. They would say, no, 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 like you are engaging in a rational endeavor, but to even be able to suppose that your rationality can derive truth therefrom, you've already made a concession to some type of like higher structural design of nature that's not like materialistic. It's do you know what I mean? Like a lot of people will argue for like transcendental arguments for
Oh yeah, it
God,
would.
right?
Oh, oh, I don't. I don't think that. Well, maybe that, or they're appealing to the sensorious, which you said like feeling. Right? It's like yeah, that's another layer of sensoriousness.
It's
You know,
written on your heart.
written on your heart, which is a level of I think somatic consideration, given like the intermediary, which is I think where like the centrist view model would be where it's in like your sight, your hearing, right? You can't deny what your eyes see, you know, what your ears hear, what you feel, and with your hands and so on and so forth. That kind of grounding, and then the next level is well, there's that feeling, and then there's emotion, right? That's obvious to everyone. If we're gonna ground this, which is where I think their strength is, like it's like well, you're you're not grounded in something that any of us can measure to one another. You don't really know how I feel, but for me, it's a more personal, right? Uh, like experience, an experience that I can never deny. Can't deny how I feel. I could deny what I see. That's questionable, right? I can't be sure that we see the same thing, but I can be sure, right? More certain of how I feel over, right? And then with that, right, the
Yeah, it's
next level,
very
which is a higher,
Cartesian.
the heart, the higher confidence would be like the somatic or the sensorious, where we're able to infer what each other sees, and then even further from that, above that is the cerebral, right? Like the idea conceptual is that where we share this common realm of ideas, and they're able to argue that, and they're like, you know what, I'm just going to give up that there's no like conceptual logic, right? There's just the obvious that they're appealing to, which is probably the again the strength of their case, or like how they might address it.
You
It's
know,
like I'm going to appeal to the personal feelings of the person, because that I'm assuming is
yeah, yeah, yeah.
less deniable.
Doesn't
Right?
seem fair in a certain sense. It doesn't seem fair. Like,
More effective maybe, obviously.
yeah, one of the reasons I always hated atheism, I hate it, especially new atheism, was that they suppose a kind of like a view from nowhere from which to like falsify different belief systems without actually like adopting any particular one, but it's very sleight of hand because obviously they are fully bought in on a very scientific view that has all kinds of like fanciful claims entailed within it, right? And it's like they think that you can kind of prove Christian wrong in some sort of like absolute sense of wrongness, like, but they don't because they place the criteria of like validity over and above and outside of like any particular uh justificatory schema. Whereas like
I would say in of itself, like explicitly yes, but implicitly, I think that's what I tried to build here is that they're appealing to the person themselves, right? They're like, hey, this experience, right, that you're having, we're assuming you're having, is our grounding. That whatever feeling you have, and actually, I wanted to address like why people have this tendency, because this is the strength. This is where the strength of their argument becomes really
Mm-hmm.
clear. Is that what they would entail is this feeling. We're going to appeal to the feeling of the person, right? And that for them, the
It's
feeling of
private.
having, yeah, it's private, and that the feeling of it is consistent and kind of, uh, you could say omniversal. They're assuming that most people feel this way about life, right? That they attribute themselves, right, to as to something, right? That I come from something else. This is a common way of attributing the world, and this is the strength. The person's intuition to feel this way is what they're appealing to. Works very well. I'll tell you why this occurs. How this is occurring is it's occurring because the relationship between us, a reproductive relationship with our mother, and that this biased relationship, which develops, this over attribution, in my opinion, occurs, right? And that tendency, right, is very common for most of us in human society to develop this relationship. And with this tendency to bond to this argument where somebody is appealing to their own internal assumption, their own internal tendency to feel this way about themselves. And with that, it's obviousness. Because I obviously feel this way about the world, and this is what they're appealing to, that personal experience, this model works really well. Although, right, the failure is that in the logic sense, right, in the comprehensive, in the self-reflection, right, as a a cognitive being, right, a recognitive being, that upon self-reflection, it nullifies itself, right? At least in that sense, in that process, right? It um doesn't come all the way around, right? It stops in that proverbial sense, right? We end up just waiting as the statement, right, that they just made is an opposition, right, to its uh, premise, which is the person that spoke it, right? And that's where it fails. But see, the strength of it is that in the that again obviousness is that thoughts, well, they're not as obvious,
Sure.
and that's their weakness, right? Is that they are like thoughts are potentia
Mm-hmm.
itself.
I'll give you a really concrete and precise example of where I think that incommensurability between competing paradigms can crop up and how it's principally irresolvable in a purely epistemic way. So, for example, burden of proof arguments, I don't necessarily extend them beyond like a very limited application. Whereas this is almost taken to be law like or like universal, that somebody making a claim has a burden of proof. And number one, you could get into like quibbling about standards of proof are already like something we've yet to fully agree upon. But put that aside for the moment. It operates within a binary logic. So the law of the excluded middle states that um, for all x, it is either true that x or it is true that not x, right? So you have this kind of like disjunctive application of the truth function. So if it's not true that there's God, then it's true that there's not a God. And so they shift the burden of proof on to the theist, who they take to be making the positive assertion that there is um, this posit called God. And if he fails to make the case, then it must be held that it's true that there's not a God. This is a very binary logic, right? Whereas for me, even as a child, even before I never had any of the terminology to really like apply to this kind of like problematic, I always seen that as being like I don't believe in negative truths in a certain sense. Like I'm sort of like a logical intuitionist in this sense, I guess. So like let me just get through this point for a minute and not me enter too much. Um, to me, the only reasonable position would be to take a kind of agnostic view, like to say there's not a God also kind of requires like a proof. You have to construct a proof to derive a truth value. This is like the intuitionist logic where they deny or restrict the application of the law of the excluded middle. They reduce it to more like a uh you know not a law anyway. And so the point of me laying all that groundwork is to say that if I'm working in a if I'm working with a view wherein the law of the excluded middle doesn't hold in all cases, I can only inevitably talk past somebody who only lends credence to binary logic. I can't actually solve this dispute in a way that all parties will be satisfied with in principle because we have um differing assumptions about like logic itself, right? And so this is like sort of a problem when the atheist stands up on his high horse and takes the high ground and says like, you guys are wrong and these guys are wrong, but then don't take this to be like a condonement of saying, everybody's right. The Muslims are kind of right. They have a right to believe the Quran, and these guys have a right to believe the New Testament. And this is like the pragmatic view where the only real way you could even attempt to resolve these kind of like um incommensurability problems between like competing views is to sort of argue instrumentally for like how well they satisfy their own purported aims. You can judge them on a case by case basis, but there's no view from nowhere which you can stand and kind of assess like all systems and arrive at this kind of default view. Like people like Richard Dawkins, they seem to be very naive when it comes to this idea of like, this is the default view until proven otherwise. And I don't think that such a thing exists. And this again gets back to the liminal model. Like I think intuitionistic logic is very liminal. Trinary logic or like many valued logics that go beyond like true like exclusively true false operators. You could have indeterminacy in your logic. You could have over determinacy. You could have degrees of truth. Like even logic itself is something that is caught up in this developmental process. And so I'm not a Muslim, but the reason I'm not a Muslim is because it's not clear to me what type of
Well done, man. By the way, that was really well said. I'm I couldn't have said it better.
yeah, the developmental process. Like logic is not overarching. It itself is subject to these same kind of whims and ebbs.
Yeah,
And when you point that out, you
indeed.
say like I'm not even working with the same underlying logical assumptions. Like I'm not even I'm not even necessarily working with the same type of logic as you are when I address these problems. And so how are we to resolve If we just continue to
Yes,
argue, it's just
it's a
continue
different
to do
sentiment.
nothing.
There's a different, simply a different sentiment and attitude with it, with that sentiment, which is that I've embraced the ambiguousness. Like, yeah, in favor of uh, generativity, which is like, okay, instead of stability, right? Anchorage, it's just the the anchoring of the story itself, the storytelling. If you think of it that way, right? There's no finality. There's just endless conclusion. You know, and the attitude, right? The way you feel, right? If we're gonna like your fifis, you're gonna get involved at some point. You're gonna peel into that, to lean on the Christians, right, and what they do. It's like, well, I like the way I feel because it stabilizes me away. Like, yeah, I've sacrificed like an ultimacy in favor of just an ongoingness, right? A novelty. Novelty is now my anchorage. Everything is just always new. And with that, like, yeah, can't say it's uncomfortably uncomfortable, comfortably uncomfortable, right? How you want to term it is what changed for me. I mean, in the pragmatic sense, right? How you're going to live your daily life. Well, how do you want to feel about it, right? Do you want to like live in an illusion, right? I guess you can, right? It works out for some. I can't say it doesn't. It doesn't look attractive, right? To become myopic and that what's the word? Attentive, I guess. Maybe is a good term. It's got like the idea of getting lost in something. I get it. I have my moments too. I guess those are in there too. And I guess I
I
get
think
to
the move
have
for
that
me
indulge.
ultimately, and we may quibble over this, but I think for me the move is ultimately to kind of pump the brakes on a certain way of talking, such that you imply a sense of like finality to your descriptions of the world. Like,
Well, you don't
um,
think you're doing that like in your like so people who listen to your videos? Like for me, dude, it's a very personal experience, and at the end, at the end of the day, it's how I feel about it. Like I
yeah,
come away
of course, yeah.
feeling
I think in
something.
a certain sense we can't help but talk as though we were like carving nature at the joints, or we were like describing when I come on here, right, and I make these videos about like the dating market, and it's assertoric, like I'm asserting this is how it is, this is what women do, this is what men are, and it almost kind of like implies a certain type of like fact of the matter that's like incontrovertible. It's like this is how it is. I'm describing reality in this objective way, and I'm making these assertions about it, and
Yeah, and it's a
you
story.
you
How it
almost
makes you
can't,
feel.
you can't quite help but do that, or else we'd be having a very queer conversation, because we would only be talking in the kind of meta language about things, right? Like we would never talk about conclusions. We would just talk about conclusivity as such, you know. We would never warrant, we would just talk about warrantability, right? When can we warrant a claim? When can we conclude that X is thus and so? Like, we would never actually have a conversation. We would only kind of like meta philosophize about things. But like, once you start engaging with the sort of like object language in the like the practical domain, it's all assertoric. This is how it is. This is how women behave. This is how boomers are. And it seems to controvert like your fallibilist position, right? Like I am a fallibilist, I think. But even within like I think Darwinism too, like not to get like too far afield with this, but it's one of the I have like a really deep problem with Darwinism because of the way that it's sort of like, or maybe the way people take it, or what people take it to mean, because they're saying like, how do I frame this? Like within the Darwinist model, it's sort of like open ended, right? There are no, everything is subject to change under certain conditionals, but yet they'll say this animal is this way because it evolved that way, and they take this to almost be like impermanent. Like women are like hypergamous, right? Like evopsych, they'll be like, that's how they are, that's how they are, in this sort of like a fixed way. They people talk about like we evolved these traits because they were adaptive, but now there's sort of like a fixedness to them. They became sticky, and we're like making, I don't know if I like really explain that well, but it's like they sort of like parasite on the idea of the fact that like things were just adapting under like given environmental conditions for such and such a duration of time, and then this is what won out. But now that these things have won out, they'll kind of remain as such, like there's a kind of fixedness that they arrived at or something. Like, but according to like say evopsych, for example, like let's even just grant like these kind of manospheria notions of like evolved hypergamous tendencies in women, they could just as well evolve right back out of those. You know what I mean? Into like this very loyal, moralistic thing, like given the right conditions obtained.
Yes.
But they won't
Yes.
grant that. They won't grant that. But it's like that they necessarily must make that concession on the evolutionary view. But it's like, does that make any sense? I think you got what the
No, no,
point
no,
there.
no. It's dude. It's par for the
They
course.
think they
It goes
are.
along
They
with
think that evolution arrives at like fixity.
it goes along with like a commitments to knowledge and dude, it's all the way down, right? This narrative, this association. Because with that would be like that something could be in of itself regardless of condition, right? Because that renders knowledge contextual, does it not? The definition of woman could change, right, along with any expectations of her behavior. But it's no,
Given the right
that you got it.
conditions, yeah,
Yeah, right.
because it's all contingent. Darwinism and the theory of natural selection or whatever, it kind of makes everything which exists contingent upon a kind of
That's why feathers, for instance, aren't
historical
always
conditions,
always used for
historical
flying.
conditions.
Seems right.
But they then have to make the concession that under varied conditions, these traits would not be exemplified, or they wouldn't be exampled in nature. But yet it seems that like Darwinists, they're completely unwilling and maybe even unable to admit the kind of fluidity of like what we find at present. It's this really weird conundrum where it's like fallibilism in and of like scientific fallibilism in and of itself is a very weird conundrum, because it should in theory almost undermine your ability to make claims about the way things are. You've seen this a lot with like COVID-19, right? Where like people would say trust the science, like these establishment talking head doctors would be like, you have to trust the science. But then boomers would push back and say, yeah, but the whole thing about science is that it is like a fallible enterprise, like it's always shifting. So like,
Yeah. Well, I mean,
and it's
even
both
just
like we're like dogmatic for the present, like what's prevailing in the here and now. But then it's very hard for us to account for like just to finish this point, and then I'll let you get in. But like
No, no, go ahead, dude.
the idea of pessimistic induction, I think, is one of the toughest like hurdles for a realist to kind of address in like philosophy of science, because it's like a very brief historical survey of like the scientific enterprise will reveal that we've always at any given time taken our like scientific commitments to be like the way it is, but now we don't believe in those. We don't believe what Galileo did about physics. We don't believe what Newton did in its entirety. So why are our current um the prevailing current scientific models like asserted to be incontrovertible? Like they're not really going to be overhauled. Like we almost assume they're not really going to be
I simply we have
overhauled.
to re-engineer our the way our intuition is developing. Ooh, that's a good way of saying it. Damn, dude. You used that word a few times, and so I'm gonna credit you for inspiring me
Overhaul?
to, yeah, like overhaul our intuition. Our the way like the way I've described things to you is that the way that we're generating these worlds, right, generating ourselves is forming our intuitions and our intuition to kind of think in this way. We can compelling ourselves to do so in contrast to how we're doing it. We're thinking we're doing it like in opposition to how we're doing it. It's forming from the very and it's very comprehensive about how this is creating. Like I said, the sense of delay, just creating this sense of attribution. You're fucking generating that, creating this distortion, and with it, a models and a language, all of it being shuttled in similar fashion in this elongated and delaying way. The whole complex, the whole thought pattern. Right? Think of it. If you think of it as like an engram, is modeling it that way. Where the delay is the uh strangely, I guess, uh is like favored rather than the action, right, that produced it. Right? Delay is favored. Yeah. Ooh, very simple way to operate it. Works for me. I know for some of you, just to like to use those two words themselves is maybe not enough for you to build on, but it's so easy for me now. I can create any story just using these very simple senses: action and delay. I can build the entire world right from that. But
Yeah, it's
yeah,
really
you know,
interesting to me. I
more of you.
really do.
Sorry, to address like the utility of like the idea to convert right to you uh the way that we tend right and our like our intuition builds, and with that the stories that we tend to favor, right, the models, right, uh that are reassuring, to put it simply, and to know why they are right, where they could promote that sense of coherence and not a novelly spontaneously generating system. It's like, okay, it works, right? I get the steel man. It's usages, right? Like Collector talked about. We start talking about context. Like it's beneficial within that circumstance. So I'm like from my perspective, something to just put into the story that this is like the world building itself, right? Just make that foundational, as if we were gonna like write a mythology that would keep that in mind all the time for its population, right? Everyone would be noting that all the time, and it would be kind of a noted subtext, right, to all the sciences, right, all of the institutions that we build, right? This is the foundation. Um, it allows us to have a more robust view of our, like I said, our sense of self, right, within that model, and with that, our, you know, ability to cooperate and resolve, right? All these other stories that we tell ourselves about how we think, like collectors, how I always think how things are not, how they're not going. Like in this, we think in the, like in the negative sense. But in order to think in the negative sense, you also have to develop this temporal pretense, which again creates this sense of delay. And I don't delay to say, I use a lot of analogies. You know, it's like an echo, right? Is a word, right? A sensorious phenomenon that might you might build the relationship when you say something, and then there's the effect, right? And you hear it like come back to you, right? Cursiveness. You know, at some point it's just like it's got to be obvious, you know, which is why I hope like one day it does, and then that sense of quietus, right? To embrace collectives is I just stop we stop talking about that because it no longer needs to be said. It just goes obviously noted by everyone around. We don't even need to talk about philosophy anymore because we know how we're doing it, right? That may just a conversation you have, when we're real young, and then from there it's just like common knowledge, and with that a common disposition, which is hopefully like the necessary generousness that we or extend, right? Like even in this conversation collective. Thank you. Right. Sigma, good job. When you were. For all of it to take place. And in the form you want it formalized language, right? You want it in like in a syllogism, like that, guys like Eltern can anchor themselves to, like, just give me a symbol with really precise lines and spacing and so on and so forth, and just for their disposition as manic as they are, right, in this development, provides them with that sense of security. I get it. And some of you out there are going to need like constructs or representations that are going to be to give you that sense. But note that even with that is going to come kind of an embracement of it, like that liminality, and with that novel instant generativity and value that you suppose of your life at all times, right? In this entire conversation, for instance. And at the heart of that, that's what we're all, you know, yeah, yeah. Which is like, I don't know, it becomes a repeat. It's even now, like, I'm like, how many times am I going to have to have this conversation? It's fun to have it. Did it get them a little further, as a sending off note on your venture, right? And curve a lot of like things that stem from this. Like I said, practicality. I know you have a particular style you like to get like sometimes to try and like we get really formal. We use a lot of references, like other characters who might have had similar sentiments. Utilizing a similar set of phrasing or a way of telling the stories. The way you tell something, if this is consistent for many of you, greatly affects how, right, things are going to turn out. And the way we do it, like here, for a small moment, is you know maybe you get to see it as I kind of steer it back there because it's like, man, I just really want to start talking that way because then I want to start acting that way because that's the tough part. Like the world struggles to treat itself in the most generous manner. You know, telling a story now that helped me inspire you to like to think of it that way, to act in that way, and right and go on go, and how that'll go, I can't tell you. I'm just hoping it's gone in a similar way, and maybe it will, um, more directly, right, with less delay than it appears to be happening now, because it's fucking frustrating as shit. I know a lot of you imagine, anticipate like futures and things you'd like to do, and like they just seem like they're really far away. That sense of delay. It's like, yeah, me too. I want them a little bit closer. Tough part is that your sense of self, right, fundamentally, as we're having that conversation, is also very delayed and distended, right? And you have a hard time like creating a sense of justification about why you should get along with me and everyone else around you. Right? You created all this, you know, and there's a way to justify like the maximization that as you already are doing, and how you're going to go about that with all of the mindfulness, and generosity you can offer at given time. And why we have to tailor it, right? Like, it's like, again, the ideas of maximizing, yeah, get it, right? Want to live in a world where we all get along? It's like, yeah, for sure. You know, I'm not thinking static, but I'm thinking just the attempt is going to be fucking an endless endeavor. So before you start assuming that we're going to reach this static bubble, right, where everything is just, like, perfect. I can't even think of that, for one thing. So let's just acknowledge that the idea of perfection is like it's the measure of incomprehensibility, you know, and just, yeah, noting that my attempts to stabilize the world cause a lot of instability in of itself, right? And to imagine alone that somehow I'm going to abate that, right, ad infinitum, man, that's how much delay, right, somebody has to believe in, right, for that to be to do what is inverted to my sense of like consistency, right, is to become the least consistent notion I can possibly fucking imagine, or that I have that I've continued to be unfathomed by, right, by its very definition. So all this seems crude though. Man, I should. I wish it was more. Always more.
Yeah,
Yeah, dude. I'm excited. What is it? Is it tomorrow?
the day after.
Day after? Yeah, man.
Gonna be a lot of time to think and to pontificate. It's what I'm most looking forward to. Isn't it funny? Like most people, they want to go to like these other places and see things. I want to see this. I want to see that. All I want is like to have a space where I can sit and I can read and reflect and I can just discuss these ideas with you and debate them and contrast them. And even in like a foreign land, it's like the most exciting thing about it is just the time that I hope it will afford me to like do my exploratory work. Very different. That's like people would come up to me and tell me, "Oh, you'll be so excited. You're going to see this thing, you're going to see that thing." And I don't really care about that kind of thing at all. My gaze is like inward. It's not turned outward. I don't find any excitement really in like occupying different spaces on the globe or whatever. People take that as like the height of novelty, tourism and travel. You're gonna go to this land. Oh my God, you're gonna see this thing, and there's gonna be this thing there, and you're gonna try this food, and you're gonna. I couldn't possibly have that be more inverted, to be honest. It's like I just want to be able to think unabatedly. That's the most exciting thing for me is just to be able to sit and think unabated. And I really gotta, thank you once again for sort of facilitating like these conversations and because it's really hard to find like dance partners. It's as you well know, this kind of brings us like full circle to the start of the conversation about your boredom. Very hard to find like an adequate dance partner when you want to and we can't do it alone. Like as you'd say, you got to build together with somebody, and the candidate pool gets very small. The more you start to kind of break off from the orthodox ways of framing and things like that. It starts to become a very shallow pool or a very small pool of candidates for a titillating dance partner or whatever. So I really hope we get
Well,
to
you know
do
what?
this more while I'm abroad and
I'd like to
set
extend
the
an
appropriate
offer.
time aside.
Maybe this would help. You know, just to say it. If any of you out there would like to talk to me, there has always been an open acknowledgement of an invitation, at least from my end. If you had needed to be more aware, uh, for however you guys might feel about me, I'm sure there's various feelings, but it's all that potential. To
All
extend that,
right.
I don't know. I've never done it. I've never solicited it before. You know.
Extending an olive branch.
Yeah, maybe just the people to know it. I mean, like I said, I can imagine various people reacting like for various reasons, not engaged because no one has it yet. I mean, in all of our casts, right? Not one person has ever reached me out outside of a commentary in the. You know, I'm not hard to find. Um, Perhaps some of you have followed and so on and so forth. Perhaps you're hesitant. I don't know. Looking forward just to engage with us at all. I don't know how many people actually reach out. Um, in these for like what are our mutual endeavor, right? These particular recordings. But whatever. Yeah, let's just experiment. See what happens. Just have people here who say it. Maybe it's comforting. Maybe it's inviting.
I've been at this for a couple of years now with you, and by myself a little bit, talking to the wall. And I found the rate of trickle amounts to one or two, at most four people a year who will hit me up in private, and they will say, I've already done a bit of background study, bit of like cursory introduction stuff before reaching out to you to kind of engage you on some of these ideas, and just to show you that I'm not like that I will invest something,
Yeah. Then we
I,
got
I will show a
plans,
little bit
baby.
of like self-sufficiency. And
Dude, they didn't even. No, they didn't hear us last time in our, you know, uh, off the record conversation. But we talked a little bit about, how to allude to it, maybe in another one, some point in deterrent we can talk more about it. But it's like we were associating with Yuval Harari, right? The futurist, eugenicist, whatever title, progressivist of his own kind. Anyway, he and that a similar endeavor, right, could be done for different reasons and different sentiments, right? That um evolving, right, our experience is possible. And I too am suggesting that in a way to do that in a way, you know, in a very deep way. How I've done it and how I'd like to share this view. Even imagine how it could be um, given a wholly different set of experiences. Right? Create a different type of person that feels differently about the world. With that, commits differently to it. Is the goal, right? And how do you get that done, right? In a very like strategic and formal way, right? With all the systems and protocols that you might imagine. And I'd really like to have discussions about that, right? Because I've got generalistic notions about where we like how we'll what we'll start talking about, but it's also very specific. Like I've narrowed it down after all these years. So part of what could like stimulate more interest in the future is like something more actionable, right? You start with the generics. Right? We simplify, right? We get our framing, and then from there the conversation. But this is how I'd like the conversation to start going. There's something like how we've done here. Right? Just imagine a different context, like how we're going to tell it to each other, or how we're going to tell it to the new people that we make, which is the hope by mastering right ourselves. I guess is how we're going to do it. Do it here a little bit with two men who are like good at playing with ideas, right? And so, and when we get personal, we say, talk about like how we engage in this process, like in a day to day, contextual, and all of its titillating fashion. And
I,
then the
I, I
medicine.
I almost find it an affront when people, I don't know how to exactly say this. I almost find it an affront when people will like relate and resonate with me based on the stuff that I put out, wherein I'm discussing like what you're talking about is the day-to-day stressors and the fights that I have with my family and stuff like this, but they sort of neglect the it's really hard to make this point. They sort of neglect the place that I'm coming from in like the way that I like the philosophical undergirding of like everything is sort of like truncated in all of these analyses of my own.
No, there's ability in your like in your
They
world
sort of
building.
just they sort of just like cast that aside. They sort of cast like my belief system aside, and they sort of just like resonate with the surface of these like commonplace incidents that I am most popular for um um putting out in video format or
Can I
whatever.
can I
Just like,
associate
oh,
this
I
way,
know.
where we think about like a
The whole
logic.
thing is built atop. The whole thing is built atop this philosophical worldview that I think just gets completely cast aside by like 90% of the people who really like it. And so I'm almost in this position where I kind of shoo them away. I'm like, I view them as like fair weather. I'm like, you guys are kind of fair weather. You don't, yeah, okay, you enjoyed like my description of like a traffic altercation that I had or something like that. But it's like, you don't get the point of me like putting that out is that it's supposed to it's supposed to elucidate like my
Can I
like
say it now?
philosophical
Damn it, man!
underlying
I've been
view.
trying for minutes. I just is that it's the same. It's the same theme operating in a different domain. That's why I watched all your videos because I'm seeing like the same logic. Your world building. Yeah, we'll talk about it in the meta sense. We're talking about philosophers and philosophies and logic and so whatever the fuck. And then maybe relating something to more political and sociological, right? Scientific, right? And then getting personal. But they're all this. It's the same fucking thing. It's just in different domains, different worlds. Right? You're applying to let your logic, your meta logic, like when you're operating at home. Like you're telling your story about how you interact with like some woman. That's you applying right? all of your meta theories in practice. It's just more the setting is more intimate. But I see you like logicking out how you're going to interact with this person, how you're going to get to your destination, right? How you're assessing your values and their value and so on and so forth. I'm watching it all play out. Just as, two people, attempting to, you know, have fun at the same time. versus another more sociological, another like higher level, higher domain, the conventional level. You're discussing interaction between men and women, or you know philosophers, right, or so on and so forth. Um, People of different social orders, races. Anyway, just trying to connect. Sorry, I really wanted to bond, relate with you. So, like I
No, I
get it. Yeah,
appreciate that. I appreciate that description. I'm fond of it.
because it's beautiful. I mean, it's like, man, this is more, it's more collective. It's yeah. You're well, he's still talking about Kant, right? When when he's relating with the woman, right here. Here's Machiavelli, right here, right? Can't you see? He's just doing it. He's doing it. It becomes more action sense, right? Than that sense of delay, which is in the the analogizing of it, as they say, right? This is what conversation becomes, endless analogies for what is obvious. You know, analogies of different like qualias, right? Some are more simplistic and formal, right?
I kind of disdain, like, this is why I openly disdain the overwhelming majority of my viewership because I feel it. It's almost like they want to just take the apple and forget the tree. You know what I mean? It's like they just want to come in and use me as like a sort of conduit for their pity party or something. They're like, "Oh man, this sucks. This
We have a
sucks."
mixed crowd, right? It's like those who like really
They
like
don't
your
understand that every single occurrence or incident that happens to me that I go on and describe and you know produce a video from, it's all intended to harken back to my like philosophical views and my philanthropic prescriptions and things like this. But they just, most people are too glib. They hear what is they hear what is said, but not like what is connoted, or they don't hear what's implied, or that they don't understand like the reasoning why um you have the kind of aversions and oppositions to like certain types of people that you do. They just want to sort of hear a voice when they're falling asleep or whatever. It's like a substitute for like a true crime podcast or something. It's not. I really kind of just deplore most of the people that listen to me for that reason. And I mean, I do maybe
hey,
take
hey,
a
I
lot of the
appreciate
blame
that
for it.
you're at least giving them some sense of coherence, right? Even in the like the simplest of senses.
It's almost the equivalent of like, you know, like a really good concert violinist, but like everybody's just there to like look at her tits or something. Like I almost feel like a woman in that way, where it's like you're just sort of here to like look at my tits.
Well, hey,
You
guess
don't
what?
really
Even if somebody wants to,
appreciate my you don't really appreciate like what I'm presenting. You're just here to look at my tits. You're just here because I'm like you're just here because I'm riffing off the boomers or whatever. You know what I mean?
that's quite, yeah, that's quite the
That
compliment,
was
though.
never my goal. That was never my goal, was to be like a black pillar or whatever.
We can
It just
appreciate
happened to be
that
the
too.
it just happened to be a very good starting to kind of build off of the discontent and like the malignment of the kind of social like the maligned dating market and stuff, was just the most obvious place to sort of recruit viewership and stuff like that. But I never intended to be like this guy that just like riffed off Foids or whatever. And I hate people that haven't really like moved with you and I beyond that. They're just sort of stuck on the first level, but they love playing it. They love playing that first level in like Mario or Gran Turismo. All they do is turn on the console and play the first level, and they're having fun. But I'm like, fuck off, man. You were supposed to kind of like you were supposed to move on with me. I gave you a pipeline, and you're too dumb, or you're too like whatever, right? You're too dumb to like. I don't know. I really loathe and disdain like the people that listen to this, but it's all for the few because there are people that as recently as 2 weeks ago, as recently as yesterday, I talked to a guy who he was kind of a private person, so I won't say much about him, but he was very just smart, and we had like a 3-hour conversation about the stuff in the food and what can be done to preserve your health, and, in this climate of like metals and plastic, and just like it's all for him. It's all for him because most of the people are very fair weather. They're very stuck in the mud, and I don't really even appreciate their contributions or support. I'm not just going to heap undue praise on somebody just because they listen to me. You know what I mean? I'm not just going to say, "Hey, this guy listens to me and supports me, therefore I'm going to praise him and thank him." No, fuck that. You're not
I
like the
get it.
kind of person that you're not the kind of
You
person
fuckers
that
can
I
make
ever want
make
to
people
associate
real
with you.
resentful sometimes. Yeah. That's
Say that again, sir.
I just for your audience, just like know that. Just you can
Your your
make
your
people.
your audio's a little bit janky.
Hey,
There you go.
better. I was uh you guys can just be careful. You can make people real resentful sometimes. Put it simply.
I love it though. I want to foster resentment amongst like the viewership on this channel because I
Hey,
don't
maybe
want
they'll
us
start doing
creating
something
a
about it.
place of the last thing I ever want to do, Sigma, is to create an all-inclusive space. I don't ever want to facilitate that, especially not for these people.
Well, if you want to get them to be more resentful, you should, because that's definitely how it happens. You try to do that, man. You just asking for people to start conflicting.
Most of the people that listen to me on YouTube are some of the dredges and the blights. They're some of the worst. They're people I would cross
Oh,
the
dude, I
street to
almost
avoid.
wish you'd
They're
bring them to
people I would
spaces,
cross
dude.
the street to avoid, and then it really throws them off. Like when I don't want to. I always keep the line open. I always keep the olive branch extended, and it's like, all right, I'll talk to you. Like you're not. There's no red flags here, but it's like I've talked to some of these guys and just been like, dude, you offer nothing, and you don't want to offer anything. You're just like you're not somebody to build with. You're just a dredge. And like I guess I'm thankful that you like watched every video I ever made and like championed my channel, but like you're not worthy of any sort of praise for it. Like you're just
Brutal.
you have to be select if you don't have standards, then like what how are you any different than like an animal? You know what I mean? It's sort of like what makes you
Oh,
distinct.
indeed. How are we different?
Quality control, like,
Hmm.
not to go on too much of like a pointless rant about that, but I see these people commenting and like they'll leave these like 3 paragraph responses and they're very like high effort, they're very fleshed out and elaborate, but it's like you missed the point. You didn't really get the point of it. Like you agreed with the conclusions, but you just didn't understand like the underlying reasoning and stuff like that. And it's like I don't even want people to necessarily like co-sign my beliefs or whatever. I just want them to be like properly understood and like properly engaged with. But apparently that's asking way too much. more often than not. So it's like, but again, there are people who trickle in and they really get inspired by this stuff, this kind of work that you and me do. And, some of them have caught right up to me very quickly. They've caught up and maybe surpassed me. So it's like it does find the mark. It's just not as often as I'd like it to. It's very slow and arduous. You put out 100 videos and maybe you'll draw in like two people, and then you put out 100 videos and you draw in two people.
Well, here's hoping we get a couple more. Yeah, it's like 3 hours now.
Yeah, I guess we'll shut her down. If you don't have anything else you want to add, I guess we pretty much shirred it all up.
No,
This
I
was
have more,
an
but
excellent
I'm running
conversation.
I'm running out of gas. Thinking about
All
the
right,
food I
boy.
made while we were talking. I'm just like,
What do you
I
got?
want to eat it. I have a peanut butter sandwich. So,
Yeah, I might go eat too. I got some rice and pork. All right, I'm gonna cut this off then, right at the
all right,
3 hour mark.
make way, guys.